Bienvenidas todas y todos.
Welcome to this discussion that we have organized in the 35th edition of the International Film Festival of Mar del Plata. And before talking about anything else, I would like to express my condolences on account of the demise of Diego Maradona, especially for the lovers of soccer. I am Cecilia Barrio Nuevo, the artistic director of the festival, and as part of this cycle of discussions with Masters, we have had discussions with Miranda July and Walter Hill, and today we are going to have a discussion with our dear and admired Albert Serra. This is cycle of discussions with masters is a unique space proposed by the Mar del Plata Film Festival on a yearly basis when we are able to visit this loved city. This edition, at this point in time, we are doing this virtually. So if you're watching this, if you want to watch this discussion, you can do it on YouTube or on Facebook. On Facebook, you will be able to access interpretation into English. About Albert Serra, we should say that his film is universal and he has an aesthetic and narrative substance that is very dear to our hearts. It is something recognizable, but it is also something very surprising. At every edition of our festival, we have been able to discover the ways in which he takes on the tradition of age-old stories and myths, whatever that is part of our deepest culture. And this goes hand in hand oftentimes with our images of our childhood, but also our fears and our fascinations. What I would also like to underscore is that when he screened his films at the festival, as well as in other festivals, we always leave the cinema feeling happy because we are treated well as spectators. These are films that talk to our intelligence, our sense of humor, and our desires. So I would like to welcome Albert Serra. Albert, welcome once again to the Mar del Plata International Film Festival. This time around virtually. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I know that your spectators are really good and I appreciate them a lot. I don't know whether you've had the opportunity at other points in the festival to be in the festival. We always try to get you to come back to the festival. It's not because I do not feel like coming back to the festival, because on the two editions that I visited you, I spent the most fun days of my life. Maybe I don't want to ruin them. I don't want to mar the memory of those amazing days, but I just have been unable to come to the most recent editions of the festival for practical reasons. But I will try to correct this situation ASAP. Yeah, we know, because we are always very happy when we know that you are shooting a new film, and we also think, well, he will not be able to make it back to the festival this year because he's at a shooting and so on and so forth. Well, I should have shot one. It would have been shot already. The production phase should be over, but by this point, but supposedly we will start shooting in April, supposedly, if nothing horrid happens. But well, we will continue to look forward to that. Hopefully things will happen for you. How do topics originate in your films, Albert? How do you select the stories and the characters with which you decide to work? Well, the subjects are chosen a little bit by chance. Sometimes they are remote topics, and sometimes these are things agreed on a consensus basis. I do not have preferences for a specific topic. Sometimes I tend to have a couple of scripts already done, which I can handle straight away, and the people that surround me in a way make the decision. But it's for party colored reasons, and it's never because of a personal interest of mine. For example, I was doing a lot of period films, and right now I am about to shoot a melodramatic kind of film set in modern times. It had to be in French because there is co-production from French companies, and I felt that I didn't feel like filming in France because it looks too bourgeois to me. So I thought about the Polynesia, the French Polynesia, as a more exotic French-speaking terrain and something that I would be interested in traveling to. It is as a result of that that the script originated. It was adapted to this stupid idea of picking a French territory that is not in France itself, and based on this, the script decided began to take shape. And well, it's like a fantasy, you know. I do not perform any kind of research. It is total and pure fantasy, things that just come to my mind. And from there on, obviously, there is something that is very important and that influences me quite a bit, which is casting, the casting process. It is very esoteric because as I never rehearse with the actors and I never speak to them, none of my actors, except for Jean-Pierre Léaud, has ever read the script for any film. So, well, there is a decision-making process when it comes to choosing the actors that involves a lot of things. It involves fate to a very large extent because I do not believe in progressive work so much. It's not that people need to communicate, you know, with the director and establish a knowledge base and a shared knowledge. First of all, because I do not have the faintest idea and I do not have any expectations. I don't have much to say either. So, well, what I like, on the contrary, is to embrace things with the same attitude that with which I visited in Mar del Plata, see what happens. And I do not have any specific preferences for results in either one direction or the other. There is an aesthetic objective, of course, that takes off based on a conceptual premise, but then the fate element having to do with choosing specific actors, well, there's always a certain security margin because I tend to choose actors that have already worked with me, but adding new people and new proposals so as to embrace things in a different though radical way and radical way. Apart from this, there are things that do change. So it's the making of the film that determines a lot of things. I don't know whether we will go deeper into this. There are several things that I do when it comes to editing and post-production, but even towards the end of the process, I myself do not know what we are doing or what duration it is taking because I will only rarely be responsible for ideological content in the film for those that watch it. This is the result of total random. You know, when you were saying that the only one that you gave the script to was Jean-Pierre Léaud, I remember when he came to the Mar del Plata Film Festival a couple of editions ago, he had an amazing memory of the work that you had done together for La Mort de Louis XIV, or the death of Louis XIV. He was very enthusiastic about coming to visit us in Mar del Plata because he learned that you had visited Mar del Plata. And Jean-Pierre Léaud is film. He himself, he is a myth that represents all of the history of film. So what was it like to work with Jean-Pierre Léaud? How did you build the character of Louis XIV together? This French king that loses the ability to command his body. Well, it was a little bit like with everyone else. There was practically no exception. Maybe the only exception was that at the beginning, because of respect or an excessive deference to him, I did not pressure him too much. Usually, in order to create intensity for images, it is necessary to exercise some kind of pressure, a serious pressure. It's like in soccer or like for any sport or it's whenever you play on a friendly basis, it tends to be a little bit boring. So you need to feel that you are experiencing a unique moment and that you're responsible for this unique moment, and that, well, people trust them and people are expecting something of them. So this pressure needs to be exercised in order to achieve intense imagery. In the case of Jean-Pierre Léaud, at the beginning, this did not happen so much, but the actors love it. I remember towards the end of the shooting, I will share this anecdote with you. It was the last day of shooting and it was freezing cold and we had to shoot a scene on location, and it was on the outside. And I was thinking, and of course, the Jean-Pierre Léaud had to wear his Louis XIV clothes, which was not too many. Um, so I said, well, we are going to go ahead and do this scene, and everyone was freezing. The people were wearing, these very warm jackets, and all the technical staff and all the crew was wearing their jackets and so on. I was thinking, oh, I hope this guy does not catch a cold or catch his death in the cold. And well, I was very doubtful, and uh, I was a little bit fearful in this sense. So we shot a very short scene so that he wouldn't catch a cold. And at one point, Jean-Pierre Léaud, once the scene was done, said, I can't remember how he said it, but he said, well, it was difficult for me. And he said, I wonder why we didn't spend more time on the scene. So I think that there is this kind of masochism that goes on with actors. They like it when the director is a little bit sadistic, uh, when the director demands a lot of them, and when he's all over them, which is, when he demands things that are at the very verge of their psychological or physical resistance. They like to be in that place. So, well, having said that, I do not see how progressive work or communication between the actor and the director can contribute to making things better to a large extent. There is something about mental or psychological independence that actors do appreciate. And in my case, it works so well because we shoot with three cameras. Well, things can adapt to this structure, 400 hours, 450 hours. I never take a look at what is actually going on. The camera is capable of capturing things that cannot be seen by the naked eye. So there are things that have become more and more radicalized in filming, and I'm more and more convinced about this. I don't think it really works to pay attention to what is actually going on or intervene too much, because in our type of cinema, the modern kind of cinema, where there is a loss of the centrality of the imagery, and you already know what the actor will say before the actor actually says it. If you do not give up on this complexity and this dispersion of images in modern film that do not intend to privilege any kind of message or convey any kind of information, um, getting this to flow in this way is only natural. And any intervention can only contribute to reducing complexity. Any communication act in film reduces, simplifies things, and I don't really understand much why, because the camera is so subtle. The fact of having three cameras, in my case, the fact of having three cameras, all of them bearing a zoom feature, positioned in different places, the actor cannot have any control on his own image. The actor becomes extremely vulnerable. He doesn't know what the cameras are doing. I don't know what is being filmed. Is it an open shot, a close shot, when there are very long takes, for example, or there are many things that the camera captures that are invisible to the human eye. I think that we just have to accept it this way. We should not attempt to reduce it or domesticate it, and I'm sure it is going to be there. We can notice that it is there in all the films. Much more so in the case of liberté, freedom, because was a lot of nudity and so on. The vulnerability becomes even more visible. The actor cannot really control his or her own image, because I don't think that there is any actor in the world that will feel more comfortable being naked than being dressed. So this entire process becomes a lot more visible. And for me, it was the definitive confirmation that the human eye and the eye of the camera need to perform diametrically opposed jobs during the shooting. It is useless to bring them together, to put them in parallel. It is useless to get the one to react taking a look at what the other one is doing, because it's no good. With the camera, when you get to the moment of the shooting, you speak beforehand with the cinematographer and with the crew. And what do you do during the shooting? Or do you just direct the actors, or do you just go with the flow? I direct the actors, but indirectly, in order to avoid uh, in order I try to direct remotely. I direct remotely in terms of time and in terms of space. Many of the decisions that are made are not made right there during the shooting. These are decisions that I make beforehand, a few hours before. I do not decide what we are going to shoot each day until the very same day. It is complicated production wise, I know, but with I do not know where things are going to know. And if I intuit because something that I did yesterday at dinner, or something that I did a couple of months ago, different factors and variables, maybe that day, because of the combination of actors that I would choose, something supposedly had to happen. It's a sort of intuition, but always of preventing that this originate right there and then. I try to take my distance in both space and time. It's not only in my own case, I also try to establish some distance with the cameras and use the zoom feature. Um, Now, during the shootings, for example, I never listen to what is going on and look at what is going on. I do not look at the monitor, but if I hear the dialogues at all, I decide to turn my back to the actors. I'm not looking at what is going on. And if I want to look at what is going on, I take a step backwards and I do not put on the headsets. Uh, I do not even want to have the full image of what is going on, precisely in order not to react in a very obvious way, which would only increase the cliche. And on the screen, there are things that I can see that I cannot see with the naked eye. So there is a sufficient chaos in order for me to have to interfere in this. And in films like Liberté or Freedom, this might have become even more exacerbated, because this film poses another type of chaos vis-a-vis your other films. Right, because the actors cannot control things, because they are so fragile. Their concerns are so many, and they affect their spirituality and their morality so much that whatever they do is really out of control. They do not even do the for example, because of this methodology, this is so extreme that they do not recognize themselves. I trust the fact that, well, the screen does what happens on the shot, 15 minutes of someone's face, for example. There will be things that the human eye will not be able to see, because I get tired, my eye gets tired, because you hear sounds, you imagine things. So I cannot concentrate unless I put something that blocks my sight, in order to have just a little hole in what I'm going to see. I will always be influenced by everything that is around me. So the camera is going to capture things that is impossible that I see. And this is what motivates me, the uncertainty of a montage, of editing. Otherwise, editing would be amazingly, unbearably boring. What's the point?
A la cantidad de horas.
How do you do with the editing in terms of the number, I mean, what you are shooting? Because I'm pretty sure that as with any, I mean, with the chaos of the continuous shooting, but then to emerge or to have the final product emerge from there, how do you go about that? Well, it's strange because the decisions also have to do with keeping in the editing. The editing involves a lot of analysis of the images, trying to maintain as much as I can the idea of chaos, yes, and arbitrary decisions, because I see all of the images and I start the editing process in a very personal way. I look at all of the images of the film from all the cameras, everything, and then I select for each scene, and I select what I like. I'm alone. We're not two, three. No, I'm alone. Obviously, it would be faster with more people, but in this first stage, I time code what I like. But what I like is in a completely different order. I may like the light, you know, the yellow light that is falling on someone's hair, or the color of the shoes, or a phrase, or this atmosphere that is created here and one doesn't know exactly where it comes from, or the color, the red color that is reflected on that wall with a green reflection of something else, or a gesture made by someone, or a dialogue between two people, but not this sentence or not this utterance. So it's arbitrary. I just follow my instinct, my criteria, with absolutely no guiding idea at that time. And then with the three editors, we just distribute the scenes, and each one is in charge of putting together the scene, only using these things that I've selected, trying to include as many of those scenes as possible. So it is quite esoteric, because you're trying to find, you know, in a different order, and obviously putting all these elements together is quite challenging. Sometimes it's impossible. It's like a puzzle. But the montage specialists are focused on this goal. And if we think about what this scene is going to convey, no one has any idea. They just need to put together the scene, including as many of the elements that I've chosen. So what it means, what it expresses, what it signifies, or what it conveys, it's not something that people are thinking about at any time. And it's a strange job, because it's half scientific, half super creative and fantasy-like. So the goal is quite scientific. There's only one way to reach that goal, but at the same time, one has to be coherent and really you have to like squeeze your imagination. But you're not thinking about characters, you're not thinking about the drama, you're not thinking about visual elements. You're just under that premise, including as many of those elements as possible that I've selected with a time code, no other considerations. Obviously, after that, the editing process evolves, but they are put together this way, and they're rarely modified. Obviously, when the whole film is structured, then maybe they will be modified, by, in general, they stay as they are. And that's why they are so intense and so unpredictable. You know, the levels of the, you know, the cuts at times, the jumps. In Liberté, there is, in Freedom, there is a lot of this, but with quite a crazy basis. And has this been the case since the beginning, since you started making films? Because it is my understanding that you did not study film, but filmology. No, I never studied film. I never learned anything from anyone. Here it says master classes. Well, I am the master, because I've never had a master come before me. Everything I know, I learned it alone. No one taught me anything, and now I've become like a master. So you sort of, you create an army and you self-proclaim the general. You proclaim yourself as a general. Obviously, you can name yourself whatever you want, right? So this is in a way the same in my case. It has been like a decanting of many different things, of constant elements that respond to a certain pattern and to a certain type of character that I have or the people that surround me. And also the playful element that is present in everything we do and which defines many aspects of the methodology. For example, why not, I don't know, why not use transition shots? Well, because it's boring, because there is no uncertainty about the complexity. Yes, and it's certain elements I find boring. So also, why not rehearse? Well, because it's better to have the inspiration of the actors, and few people have this take this into account. Very few directors, I mean, when actors are inspired, you know, they're more inspired on one days or than others. And the fact that you only use the material of the days where they are inspired, you know, it's something that people don't take into consideration often. And one presupposes that actors are professional and they come here and they provide their service every day at all times to convey a series of ideas or content that are previously agreed upon. So the idea of having everything at the service of an actor's inspiration, and one thing that is for sure is that one doesn't know when this inspiration will appear, but at least have the cameras rolling so that when inspiration strikes, then we're ready. And when people are inspired, of course, what they do is much more interesting, right? And if you're having fun as well, right? If you're in a space where, like you said, that is playful and yes, fun, that's a good thing. That pressure that I exercise, that tension and that responsibility that actors have, although I do not hold them accountable, but this pressure is felt. And I think that directors in their communication, I mean, there is like a dormant violence. And so even if it's a playful environment, this violence is there, it's present, because it's an aesthetic obsession. There's aesthetic value in that, and people, I believe, have to be at the level or have to meet these expectations. And since there's no script, no rehearsal, the actor is under a lot of pressure. What you are saying about the pressure on one hand, but also often the actors are either representing or surrounding one milestone in particular, or one situation, but they have like a completely natural element. So in a way, you naturalize or emphasize the most human and natural aspect of myths. I think that's a consequence of the methodology. It's not something that I necessarily look for. I like to have two extremes. I can have a starting point, you know, that might be quite far from our reality or real imaginary. Of course, there can be an iconic collective imagination, but we can turn it into something more arbitrary. I don't know, mix Casanova with Dracula, you know, combine these things, just anything goes. But at the same time, and through the same methodology, we have the human aspect, but more than human, I like to use the word organic, because it is so wild, you know, in the lack of communication and the sense of abandonment of the actors. Actually, Freedom, Liberté, is based on a play that I did in Berlin in the Fonsbühne, which was not very well received by the critics in general, for the people from theater, which is it's not very open-minded, if I may say so. They didn't like it very much. But one of the actual criticisms, negative criticisms, one of the things read, 2.5 hours of actors abandoned on the stage. And I said, wow, that's exactly what I was looking for. I felt it as a positive criticism, but this abandonment, which creates a real atmosphere of abandonment, the actors, left alone, it creates this raw, sort of almost unbearable feeling for the audience. And so this is a sensation that I've always enjoyed, that I've always liked, especially when there's cinema in between. Obviously, the camera is able to find concrete things that will be able to put something together. But in the abandonment of theater, there is something of like organic, physical, out of control element, where you're not connecting many things. You're just like left to fend for yourself. So from my point of view, this obviously this subtlety that can be captured, the camera can sort of consolidate it without undermining the complexity. The camera doesn't think, so they cannot kill the beauty of things. Many directors do think and are in charge, or set out to destroy what the camera and even the actors had carried out. But anyway, this abandonment is in a way natural, but less violent than in theater, and that's why it's interesting. In the theater, the actors cannot stand this abandonment, and they need the warmth of the audience, they need the round of applause at the end, and what they do to find that is cliches and things for people to easily understand. Today, a theater actor is a very rare thing. And they cannot be on a stage and do things that people will not understand, that people hate, that people feel uncomfortable with. It's very rare to find nowadays, to find actors that can go along with these attitudes and put up with the fact that they might hate, that the audience might hate them or feel indifferent or other feelings. What they need is they need the communication, the warmth of the audience, the applause. And so this abandonment is much more difficult to solve. In cinema, it's different because, there's a technical team, there are other intermediaries, and, the film will come out a year and a half later. There's a performance. Yes, there's a distance, both from a time and a space perspective. Yes, in my case, this is quite radical. This abandonment is quite felt. But I would say still that this is, from a human, not so much of a human perspective, but more than a humanist content. And it makes me feel that we're, sometimes you feel like you're right there, cliches just around the corner, so you try to avoid it. And with this abandonment, I believe that you never know what is going to happen. With Liberté, with freedom, I know that you did the play, but I haven't seen it. But what I did see was the exhibit that was organized at the Reina Sofia Museum, which has to do with the play and also with Liberté, if I'm not mistaken. So I was wondering, how did you work with these three artistic environments? Because as a spectator, watching Liberté in the theater and then being a viewer, an attendee at the Reina Sofia, was very different experiences. From your perspective, how did you work with these different environments? I had a similar, but with an advantage, which has always been the case. When you work for the Castle Documenta exhibit or the Venice Biennale, that people aren't expecting something coherent from a narrative perspective, and not even from a visual perspective. Everything is sort of the same. So this methodology that I was describing of choosing what I like best, you can do it without even considering homogeneity. And this becomes a more radical piece of work. When we were putting together the film, Liberté, the exhibit at the Reina Sofia was right in the middle of the editing process. And this allowed us to be more lucid and be more radical in our point of view on the material that we had in our hands. And even going further and only finding what we really, really liked, that was the only way of making the films. So we weren't putting together the film based on fear that we wouldn't have a coherent film or that it would be a failed product. So it was shot in a very random, crazy way, in a sort of everything was very, everything flowed, blurred, no limits at the level of the content. And so you could be a little bit afraid when you started with the editing, maybe the fear that this wouldn't even make a film. But I think that thinking about it for an installation is, let's choose the very best, the good. And we thought of good images and nothing else. And there were no dialogues, really. The installation was merely physical sensations and visual stimuli. But so we couldn't feel anything concrete. And when you have this attitude during the editing process, it really helps, in a way, it helps evolve contemporary cinema. So the editing process is not used to clarify or simplify or homogenize to an extreme, because a certain level of dispersion, as Farber used to say, could still be present in the images, and that's in a bit the structure of the film.
What you were saying in connection with Manny Farber, we are going to take a look at some of the questions in connection with that, because there are people that are already writing on the various channels through which they are listening to our conversation. And in connection with Manny Farber, there is a video that you made recently, and you were saying there that one of the big influences were the American critics such as Manny Farber. Why do you think it is important for film to have the critics, and how has the way of interacting with your critics evolved? Well, because of this reason, as I never attending any shootings and as I never went to a formal film school, my profession is mainly based on my practice. And I started to see that with digital cameras, with digital editing, which is very important as well, things could be done. You could do things the way you wanted to, and you could invent, you could make up a methodology of your own, and you did not need to copy anyone or know anything about anything at all. And this leads to the fact that the only influence that might happen is the analysis of films. Given the fact that there was a lack of formal education, Manny Farber has interesting texts on actor direction, for example, and he had cutting-edge ideas on this idea having to do with the fact that the most perfect performance would happen if the actor were filmed without him realizing it. And this could happen as part of the director's concrete interests, but the actor should never realize that he was getting filmed. And he said this back in the 1940s, and applying this to films of that time or of the 50s. And it's very interesting when actors are analyzed. Manny Farber, for example, has this analysis of actors that dates back to the 40s and 50s. It talks about dispersion with regard to set design, for example. He was very interested in analyzing this. Laurel and Hardy, for example, they said that they were dispersed vis-a-vis Keaton. He spoke about the inadequacy of actors vis-a-vis the mise en scène or the subject or the set of the film in order for this to become visible. And it's exactly this. The character, to become visible, needs to include the actor in order to make it wealthier or richer. And there needs to be a certain inadequacy vis-a-vis the context of the film. So he says that it has to be at the threshold of adequacy. Manny Farber created all of these ideas or elaborated these ideas which manifested themselves later in my own work, but I didn't remember his ideas when I created my films, but it happened as a matter of fact, because digital tools enable these considerations or intuitions that were conceived by writers because of the methodology at stake, because of the absence of an academic vein. There is a natural discovery as a result of this, of all of these intuitions that these theoreticians had because they were very smart and because they were very acute in the analysis of their images. This also develops a specific taste, even though it may sound bourgeois as a criterion. Good taste, in the sense of the definition of a film as good or bad, is something that is also fashion dependent. Clearly enough, it doesn't make much sense for a critic to think this way. Analyzing the internal logic of the film and its formal connections, but for a director, appealing to the influence of good taste and the definition of why a film is good or not, I think that is useful. And if you've chosen your critics well, you may have a slight influence. For example, I like two critics equally, and one critic says that the film is good and the other critic hates the film, and both critics may be right, even if they disagree. So the fact of creating a body of work that will bring you closer to a specific type of imagery and drawing you away from another type of imagery is not bad at all. It's a vision of the world, a vision of the world that does not involve ideology, it does not involve a specific type of content, it does not involve anything deep. I think it's just a useful tool when it comes to putting together images. And many of these critics, I don't have an opinion of my own on many aspects. I follow other people's opinions, people that are smarter than me. And I decide to focus on creating my own opinion on topics that cannot be reflected upon so deeply as I reflect on them, especially because of the practice that I have developed for years and hours and hours and hours and thousands of hours of work. So it's a strange mix of idealism on the one hand and extreme pragmatism on the other. And that might be summarized. That summarizes what I've been doing in recent years. So I have a high degree of pragmatism in most of the decisions, most of the aesthetic decisions that I have made. I don't know whether it's a good sign or a bad sign. If you take a look at there are many films that were flops, that were a disaster. Why? Because he did not have digital tools. That is why he created these failed movies that were as intense or as original or as nuts. He would not have lost his luck in a way, but he might have won in homogeneity terms. He may have added a little bit good taste or greater precision in the combination of images thanks to the digital technologies, and this would have enabled him to remove the elements that led to these films becoming failures. So, but the authenticity of his cinema has to do with other elements. It's I think that there is a whole world that Pasolini portrays that is no longer, that no longer exists. I don't think that a director nowadays might be able to do the exact same thing with the exact level of authenticity. In connection with what you were saying, imagery, how to deal with images today, and maybe the way Pasolini dealt with images, talking about the possibilities of film. One of the questions is, over the past few films, you have been working with the manipulation of images during editing. Is there something that cannot be concocted or intervened? Or that's an interesting question. I don't have a limit at this point in my life because with regard to the synthesis or the synthetic images that I use, I I think that very few people are doing this. The objective of these synthetic images is that these are compositions of a couple of images from the same film with an actual index. That is, the fatality that happened is right there, the organic thing is right there, but on the same shot, there are two or three shots. They get connected because there is a connection. But it is a perfect production, but they are mixes of real life images which have been recorded and where the significant presence of the human factor, in the sense of the bodily attitude, the bodily presence of a person inside the image has not been modified as yet. I don't know if you might be able to modify the expression of an actor's face when he's doing something. Maybe you can modify it digitally. This, I don't know whether this might act as a limit because it would eliminate the reality component. It would oversimplify things. Maybe that would be my boundary, when what you're doing does not reduce things, but rather it amplifies the wealth or the richness of the world. So if you have to modify the image, it would seem that it doesn't make sense anymore. And the other thing is, it is used because there are latent feelings which we didn't know how to express, which we do not know how to express as yet. And that is why we use this synthesis-based post-production, because we don't even understand what expresses ourselves, what it expresses ourselves, but we intuit that it may express something. When we understand that that might kill the original imagery, maybe we should rethink things, but I really can't define. I have never found this because I still do not have the digital post-production tools that are so sophisticated as people in Hollywood may have in order to create completely made up synthesis images of expressions of faces of actors that do not exist in reality, but who have absolute credibility. I suppose that that is in our future, and oftentimes people say that in the United States, for example, the police departments have full command of this. For example, not long ago, I saw on the internet that they pick ancient images of historical characters, relatively modern because of the quality of the images, of the pictures, and they make them say other things. And it is not that they do lip syncing with an actor's voice. They move, they actually use algorithms to move these characters' lips or these characters' eyes so as to get them to say something different. Well, I don't know whether that's true. That can also be valid. I don't know whether there is an ethical boundary in this search. I really don't think so. I think it is the feeling of the artist that does not want to go into a specific terrain. There is an equivalent of this that is very interesting and which I experienced. It is when the actors wear this little headset, like an earpiece, and you have to tell them, this earpiece is used in order for them to hear what you want to tell him, what to tell them. I know that I use this quite a bit in the art world, and especially for one film that I shot. And I started to experiment with that in the more conventional fiction feature films. And there came a point in which I would notice that it didn't make any sense to wear these earpieces. It was as if you could handle the actor with a joystick. Instead of creating unpredictable or unbelievable situations, instead of being able to actually help the actor, even by confusing him or her, being able to generate, instead of being able to generate more original moments, things became more mechanical, and there was a loss of originality. So that was the boundary for using the earpiece. I suppose that the same may happen with what is purely visual, when the limit, when the atmosphere that a tool creates is less fascinating or less mysterious than what was created by previous forms of film, then what's the point? I don't see ethical problems aside from that. And you do know that I have a deep appreciation for actors. So this is a little revenge on my side as well, because I know how much money they collect. They also need to get credit for what they do, especially for the film liberté, freedom. You have to give them credit, and the degree of of willingness to expose themselves and to abandon themselves to danger. That is something that was very honorable as an attitude on the actor's side. And I don't think that it is something that just any human being might be able to do. So there is a combination of both things. On the one hand, the work of the actor, as my work as a director, and any form of work entails going betting on risk on a permanent basis, of course being pragmatic at all times, experimenting like crazy in order to produce a bad film. Well, that's not something that interests me. But as part of this pragmatism, if exposure if exposure to risk, to danger is as strong as possible, I would say that that's a value, and I think a value that should be pursued. And this affects the individual, because the actors need to work with their bodies, with their personalities. So this risk is embraced in a different way than when it is done by a director or a writer or by someone else. Imposing that pressure on yourself is quite a bit, but actors do not suffer psychological catastrophe as hard as other people. For example, have you ever acted? Yes, in theater, I directed two plays in which I acted. I don't know whether I might be a good actor. I think that there are a lot more actors, there are a lot of actors that are far more interesting than I am. But in the theater, I thought that in the center of action, when there are a lot of elements, I had written the play and I directed it. I thought that as an actor, I might make my contribution, not only because of my participation as an actor and my acting being interesting for the spectator, but because of other factors, what I could generate in real time, and also to be able to control my fellow actors, because actors need the public to applaud them so much that you may have been rehearsing with actors for months on end, and then there's the opening night and they do exactly the opposite. And there's nothing you can do because you're already on stage. So uh, fuck it. But and during editing, you can do whatever you want. But that's not true for theater. So that being an actor was a way in which I could control the actors more. Uh, as an actor, I could exercise more pressure. But I was not an actor, and the play was in German, which I did not understand. And something that should really have been fascinated, because the remains of this remained, the, the remnants of what I wanted to do remained, but I think that this was turned into more vulgar things, and for refined people, this was unfinished. I redeemed myself. I shot the film, and besides the screening at the Reina Sofia, which was a real wonder, I was thinking in connection with performances and actors. If you had to choose a figure of the history of film to shoot a film, did you ever think about that?
Sobre un actor, un director, como alguna figura de la historia del cine, como
Yes, an
trabajar
actor or a director or someone, that you would work with, or, well, especially when you have to deal with recent characters that have real images already, things become more difficult. One can try, but for example, like Fassbinder, in the world of art, you can already have like a more critical point of view. But you have to think of a film with characters that already have real images. And I'm talking about 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century more precisely. But the risk of, doing something, kind of quirky and awkward is very high. And so it is a challenge, and one can take on that challenge, but one, I think, would have to think hard, and I would be careful about the authenticity. If you have to do a film about Woodstock, for example, or about the 60s, how are you going to recreate that? Problem there is that with the cameras, it is so subtle. What the cameras capture and the human eye cannot capture is what people have inside of them. In Ibiza, and it's an island in the Mediterranean, very famous for the parties, and we're in the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s were very important. And there was a discotheque there called Pacha, very famous. And the manager was interviewed one day, and he said, well, they were asking him about the differences in the nightlife, the clubs and everything. And he said, well, before, people took the party or the partying inside of them. Now you spend a fortune to entertain them and they get bored. You spend a fortune on, music, loudspeakers, and the architecture with 1,000 things, and people get bored anyway. So this idea of what you have inside of them, and that those people have the party spirit inside of them. It was the spirit of the time, and they had it in them. So imagine if you had to create a film about Woodstock, you would never be able to uh, reflect that intensity because people had it inside them, and the camera would capture that. Maybe in a theater play, not so much, but in a camera, when you're shooting and you have, a close-up shot, I mean, if it's in them, the camera will capture it. And to really falsify that, when you have a comparison with the real image, if not, it's a unique fantasy, yes, and it becomes something that may or may not work. And it might be mysterious, it can be mysterious in a way, but when there's a comparison with the real, it's a challenge. Not saying it's impossible, but it's a challenge. Yes. Well, I'm a big fan of Marlon Brando, for example, and he was completely crazy. And it's actually true. One of the main influences for this film, it might seem like nonsense, but it was a book by Marlon Brando's wife who wrote her autobiography, and especially the part where there's no Marlon Brando in it, just parts of her life. So I think that that came into my head, and at the end, I don't know, it ended up in Polynesia because of that, but not the part about Marlon Brando. I love him. He was completely crazy, and I'm a big fan. And that's why I was so interested in the interpretation. And I consider it something which, especially in the context of academic films that could be made at the time, the chaos of real life was much higher than reality. Imagine that two worlds, I don't know, in an Andy Warhol world, and really put together and making a whole. I don't know if you have a film by Bertolucci or like Kazan. I mean, there are very boring things. And the only time that I attended a shooting, the only time that I went to another film set apart from mine was in a Sokurov shooting, and I spent just a few hours there, and I found it extremely boring. And it's supposedly a signature cinema and everything, but I found it extremely boring. It didn't have the atmosphere of your shootings for sure. Not even close, not even close. I'm not saying that it's necessarily bad, but the shoot is actually a phase of the creation of that image. It's a methodology. So, I mean, if it works for him, and it actually does work for him, and many of his films are really good. So, in that case, it works. But for me to create the sort of mythology, and for people really, I mean, I was never influenced by other film directors, actually. I was more influenced by my own life, music, literature. I mean, film as a tradition did never really had a strong influence on me. Obviously, I'm a big film fan and I know films very well, but at a personal level, wouldn't be in a position to tell you why exactly, but nothing really interests me. I don't know, like Warhol, but it's sort of at the fringe. It's film, but it's not really film. Things of the 60s, things of the avant garde, obviously Buñuel, but people very sort of at the limit. The normal cinema as we know it, like conventional films, don't interest me very much. I can understand certain aesthetic achievements of Hollywood films, for example, but it really does not motivate me as an artist at all. They're asking, what is your relationship with contemporary cinema, and which directors do you admire that are currently working, or do you look forward to seeing their films? Well, I think that cinema is at a very interesting moment right now, since the 60s or the 70s, because everything is possible now. And we're starting to see that any film is possible, and we continue to have more possibilities, more paths, more aesthetics, and I mean, classic cinema I've already seen. I don't see it anymore. I consider it a waste of time right now. I feel like I'm wasting my time. I prefer to go to a bar with friends. I will be have more of an influence with that than with classic cinema. With contemporary cinema, watch it to copy things or to see how they do things so that I can maybe adapt it to my own personal way of doing things, or how it can be useful for me. And because of different reasons, right? You'd be surprised. Of course, I like many of the works that are done with the actors. I like Ulrich Seider, and it has nothing to do, but I'm highly impressed because of many mysterious reasons. How the hell did they do that? Yes, these actors, how is he doing that with the actors? Have they been deceived? Or, I mean, many documentary filmmakers, Bin Sarian, I mean, many people that I've been interested in for many years, and anything new that they put out there, I'll be interested in. Romanian directors to a lesser extent, but Portuguese directors also very interesting work. There are many people doing many interesting things. And I don't know, Gaspar Noé, for example. I really liked what he used to do, but I consider his latest film a masterpiece. And I like him, and I like him as a person, but his previous films was not very interesting. But I consider that his latest film is a very important film. But it's because of personal reasons. It's personal reasons. And if I'm interested in that, it's probably some unprecedented feature of contemporary cinema. And I like to learn from this. And I follow them, I follow their work, what they do at festivals. But I also do, it's not that I'm devoted or like I'm faithful to it. It's just very personal. It's a mix of interest and admiration for other people's work, but also a pragmatic perspective of using it for myself. A bit malicious, you know, in a way. You were saying that spending time with friends at a bar would be more inspiring than maybe watching classic cinema. And I'm very curious to think about what made you study philology. Well, because literature is the highest form of art. And it is actually the only, I mean, reading, I mean, about cinema, you can only learn through reading. So reading is really the only way to learn things. It's not similar to any other system to learn things. So literature is what I'm most interested in. I cannot think about any other things. It's the door, the gateway to everything. And it actually includes it all. That's where the beauty is. It includes philosophy, it includes history, it includes psychology, it includes visual arts. It really includes everything. It is the only art, I mean, cinema also too, because also as a language, it can incorporate many things of the verbal language through the dialogues. But anyway, I think that in terms of purity and in terms of difficulty, I think that it's the highest form of art, and there is really no stupid writer, but stupid film directors, many, and bad film directors, many as well. It's another type of pulsion. Have you ever thought about writing a book or writing a story or a script for a film, or making a film based on something that you wrote? No, but I write all the scripts, I wrote the play, but always with a practical objective, something that will be made, not something just for the sake of it. And in this position, you know, sometimes there's a lot of wasting of time, but it's the only guarantee of really continuing to make films the way that I wish to make films. I wouldn't know how to make them any other way. And you always have this dream, you know, like Valerio Surbini, Prima Noti di Quiete, that I like very, very much. It's a masterpiece. And it's the first day of tranquility, which is the day you die, basically. So you would need this tranquility, this first day of tranquility, to have the time and the peace of mind to think about all of these things and how it's so consuming of your energy. You were talking about documentaries, but fiction films have a different kind of imprint in the sense of the money. Florencia, yes, it's much more expensive without a doubt. However, I will be making a documentary which is quite complex now. It focuses on toreros, on bullfighters, and the suffering of bullfighters. And it's a documentary, but it's also complicated in this case. So documentaries can be quite complex sometimes, and the difficulty. But it's true that fiction is much more complicated. It is true, more challenging, except from the grand masters of documentary, like directors from China and Russia. In fiction, you have the direction of actors and also the precision in terms of how you work with the actors. So that's, I think, the most difficult thing. I mean, except for the grand masters, I think that sometimes you have to find this ideal point of organicity, but also extreme fantasy. All of this combined in the face of the actors. All of these things are quite complex to achieve, quite risky as well. And they're never perfect. So it's very difficult to find. My character of Casanova in the story of my death is able to achieve this extreme organicity, and it's quite striking, I would say. But it's very specific cases. It's like one moment or a few moments in some of the films that I've made. But honestly, this goal, this utopia of fantasy embodied in a raw way, more raw than reality, but also more fantastic than anything that we can imagine. This is the utopia that one seeks, and it's the most difficult thing for filmmakers. You're working with humans. It's not like writing it, yes? You are working with humans. It has a complexity that's completely different. Another question from the audience is pertaining to something that you mentioned before, that a film has to take risks. And they ask, how do you maintain that sense of risk without repeating yourself? Well, I think that I've achieved that. I think you need more and more violence, a more higher and higher complexity and more sophistication, so that you even confuse yourself. And the subtlety, you know, because it has to increase so that you can no longer control it. So you have to avoid simplification as much as possible, because if you didn't do that, then it would be under your control, and so you wouldn't move forward in that direction. So more violence, more complexity, so that, yes, violence to exercise on others and complexity to surprise yourself. Basically, there is no other recipe. But this is in order to reach the ultimate paradox, which is reaching innocence. I mean, you have to have an actor that continues to be naive and to learn things. But for people who need to control certain technical or conceptual aspects, I do not see any other way from the one I just described. And it's contemporary art that's going in that direction. If you watch series, you know, On TV, obviously, they go in the other direction completely, even if it's a detailed social analysis of any situation of life. No, there's nothing there. I mean, complexity of the image, it's not a filmed journalism. That's not what we're aiming at. The best series, I don't know, it, some of them were made by journalists who make an investigation of a subject as complex as possible, and they illustrate it through images. Each chapter is directed by a different director, and the script is written by someone who is not thinking about a fantasy of one person, but based on people discussing. If I see an image, I can tell you automatically if the origin of that image is a script written by several people, as typical in TV series, or if it's a script written by one. So you can tell the difference right away, difference in the elements that are part of these images. And of course, this can take on a completely different direction. And I mean, that is fine what series do, but it's completely the opposite of the type of films that in my point of view, is contemporary filmmaking.
One last question, Albert, and we feel extremely grateful for the time that you have shared with us. But just one more question in connection with author cinema and contemporary or modern cinema, and in connection with your cinema, how do you think you will be remembered in the future? I really couldn't care less about how I might be remembered. I know that I will be more remembered than most of the directors that surround me once in my circle. There's no doubt about that. But I also know for sure is that I really don't make any bones about it. I really don't, I couldn't care less. And it's so uncertain as well. It's very difficult to use the objectivity that the people in the future will use to judge our things or our work. It's very difficult to know that. There are different components that are valued, for example, for the artists of the past. So I'm past caring. I really don't care. And I mainly focus on the fact that a couple of people that are currently living in the world do value me because I trust their criterion. I trust the way they think. And well, the future is not in my hands. We shouldn't worry about that, which you cannot change. So I really couldn't care less. I am here somehow. I do know perfectly well whether one of my films is a little bit better than another one, or if it really contributes something. I cannot fool myself, and I do know what of my films are my faves, and I might think about why these films are my faves, and that may be valued in the future. The contribution that one of my films or that some of my films make, but above and beyond this, and I'm doing this not because I want to think about the future, but because in the coming movie that I will make, will I keep that which I like, which I think is valid, and I will try to add more new stuff to the coming projects. But once again, this is a small token of my pragmatism, and because otherwise I would not even think about it. There is a poet that is a great writer and a fabulous film critic. He has written a beautiful book now that we are talking for Latin America. It's called Cine y Literatura, Film and Literature, Bergim Ferrer. I think that you can get this film in Argentina. It's very educational. This person said one day, I wanted to make an exhibition on him, and he said, I don't interest myself. Per Gim Ferrer is his name. So I said to myself, well, that's so right. So any thoughts that I might have about myself will always be cynical in a way, because I am very pragmatic when it comes to filming my next project, but in connection with whatever happens to me, in truth, that is something that does not interest me. Albert, we love all of your films. You have your own faves, but I think that our faves are all of your films. So we are really looking forward to watching the Bullfighters and the Polynesia films that that are part of your next two projects. I think that they will happen. The funding is coming. Of course, the shooting was compromised, but hopefully we will be able to rise to the occasion like the bullfighters do, because these guys are courageous or what. So I always want to be consistent with the subjects that I deal with. So hopefully I will be as courageous as the bullfighters that I will talk about in my project. I will be as courageous, hopefully, as those bullfighters. It's really impressive to see them. And as a minimum, I expect that the film will reflect this courage that the bullfighters have when you took a look at it from up close. If you look at the world of bullfighters from up close, it's very impressive. I want to do them justice. And for that, I believe that I have to be as courageous as they are, not only for this film, but all of my future projects. It depends on me, of course. Therefore, I will be courageous. Compared with their courage, it's a different type of courage. Of course, I don't know whether I will be as courageous as the bullfighters, but I will try to be as courageous as a film director can be. Thank you, Albert, for everything. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for joining in this I Will Endure edition that we are putting together in Mar del Plata. Thank you so much for joining us in this adventure. Thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of all of the teams that are responsible for the organization of the Mar del Plata International Film Festival. And also, I would also like to thank the people that have made this conversation possible. One of the people that is coordinating everything is Michelle Jacques Torriglia, Lydia Stevens, Macarena, Mariana, and all the members of the staff. Thank you again, Albert. It has been really beautiful to have this conversation with you. Hopefully, we will have our future conversation live in person in the festival, and hopefully, we will discuss all of your current and future projects. Hopefully, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening to me. I always say that being in touch with a festival is really nice because it brings good memories. I want to congratulate you on your catalog as well. It's a very rigorous and very good catalog. And congratulations on doing things in spite of the crisis. This is a festival that has been organized thanks to the National Institute of Film of Argentina. It's a well-established festival. So above and beyond difficulties, it will continue, it will overcome. So we will stay in touch. Thank you.